So as Alex suggested, we're going to start with failure. We thought we'd start with a discussion of terminology. Last night at dinner, and as I think all of our talks reflected, we all have varying degrees of ambivalence about the language assigned to our panel. The phrase, one of you uttered the phrase, being against a language of metrics and boosterism. So we thought we'd start with some words: community, connectivity, responsiveness, value. What are the politics of these words? Are they adequate? Are there better alternatives? And do they create a false consensus? Have at.
Well, I mean, I think certainly for the corporations with departments dedicated to so-called community engagement, the issue of false consensus is very, very real and relevant to them. But then there's also so many people using the internet for whom community is a word that is newly available to them and describes a very novel experience because they're able to find peers where they didn't elsewhere, and the ability to transcend geographical and even, although not to the same extent, economic barriers towards connecting with each other. I mean, think of, say, members of diasporas or first-generation immigrants, or the lone queer kid in a very conservative high school. I mean, these are people for whom the internet has really and truly been remarkable in terms of giving access to communities are in process of being built. But again, as I mentioned before, that's a conversation that can't be divorced from the existing and definitions of community that we're all sort of here grappling with and what they mean to different people and places and institutions.
Yeah, and I certainly didn't mean to demean the genuine feeling of connecting with others and of togetherness that we associate with community. And I mean, I think that I wish there were another word to use as a substitute, but I meant mostly to differentiate community as a discursive construct that is often used quite imprecisely, if not irresponsibly, and that that is of course not the same thing as the kind of the feeling of community that you're describing, and I guess what I mean, and what this book I mentioned speaks about. I mean, it's a kind of anthropology of community. One of the most extensive study in that book is of a queer theater organization in San Francisco, and she is primarily interested in the way that this discourse around community shuts down various kinds of difference and creates certain kinds of exclusion, which are generally concealed in our usage of the term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems that the kind of bad faith use of these terms has even though on the one hand one can criticize that they're being used disingenuously, but then at the same time it seems to be like a lot more interesting to start to see them as being completely structural, right? That this is actually these are actually the protocols that we can only be following. And this is like something that we were thinking about with like the politics of shine issue in January, and then the part in the super community issue, where advertisement and like a projection of purpose and advertisement of what the community is or could be is the only way to actually exist, right? Like the opposite of inflating yourself or seeming bigger than you are, trying to market yourself. The opposite of this is like some kind of obsolescence, or this is at least how it's felt, that you will just simply disappear if you don't try to project your image forward. But then the question is really like, what kind of like strange communal dystopia does that contribute to? I mean, with this, I always think of. I mean, I think it's also very important to approach these questions on many different scales, where also there's a strange kind of parity between like the way that marginal groups operate and the way that actually, if you go up to higher echelons of power, the way that actually power functions, like the marginal practices are being used on vastly different scales. I always think of this.
Can you give an example?
Yeah. I mean, I always think of this Dutch, brilliant Dutch designers, Metahaven, who are great researchers and always kind of stumble upon these kind of extremely large scale phenomena. They did a text on state branding where they basically beautiful formulation where they said actually most, it's also has to do with the question of the state we were talking about yesterday. Basically, if you look at tourism advertising for Greece or Spain or something like that, everyone knows the logo for España, right? Do you have that? I mean, or who can think of this logo for España with some circular thing? You kind of have it embedded in your mind, right? But in these logos that are produced for states to brand themselves as tourist destinations are actually more recognizable to us than the national flags. So I mean, who can remember the Spanish flag? I kind of can, but I really remember the tourism logo, right? So this kind of marketing, this kind of marketization it has such powerful effects that we somehow have to find ways to take it very seriously.
I mean, what you guys have just said reminds me of a few things. One, that marketization of borders, right, has implications for the ways that communities are policed, because then, again, it relates to the way that those borders are able to be co-opted and replicated and reinstituted by places with a great deal more power. And what you said about the inadequacy of the term community and the necessity for perhaps needing new vocabulary to address the different types of community at work, I think it might be productive to then compare the word community to the word public, the different types of publics that exist, and sort of, over dinner last night, that's one of the things we talked about, was the idea of being in a moment in which we have ever-increasing richness of public and more amounts of dialogue, whether it's a culture of, TV criticism in the age of shows like Mad Men or Breaking Bad, or the ability for marginalized voices to sufficiently antagonize the racism or misogyny of establishment media. And while there's that, the idea of an ever-increasingly active public sphere with ever-decreasing amounts of power. Mm-hmm. So really active public sphere that has no power.
Yeah, I mean, this relates to what you were saying about visibility in a surveillance state. That, right, I mean, however much agency and presence you might have within the public sphere, that could very easily have no political effect or no possibility of achieving any political effect. There's not a direct equivalence.
Or at least positive political effects, because we're certainly seeing policies being that were produced with respect to the political effects of these online engagements. So the ability of state agents have always been able to infiltrate various political organizations. But I'm thinking of all the cases that a Facebook status has led to the arrest and detention of people. So whether it was, recently a black man who expressed dissatisfaction with the police on Facebook, and it was perceived to be an active threat against a cop, and he was charged, or the student in England whose academic research at a university on terrorism was interpreted to be, researchers becoming a terrorist, and he was put in jail. And so the idea of, and those aren't uncommon. There have been a lot of people who've, been met with significant, state political repercussions for the things that they've expressed or shared online, and the ways in which those expressions can be used as evidence against them. And so that's just one of the ways in which the social position of anyone is replicated on their within their online presence. And it's still, we are not escaping the policing that state does, and we're not escaping the borders and co-option that corporations always practice on us when we do what we're doing differently online.
I also think that there's this incredible dislocation, right? The differences between how we use these technologies and then how we view how others are using them. I think of all of the incredible and ferocious shaming of people who've said things that have met with disapproval on various social media, and this idea of how could anybody do this? How could anybody be so stupid as to do this? But of course, we're doing this all the time, and there's this way in which we've been talking about various speeds and what are the speeds at which we want to exist. And one of the things that occurs to me as being related to that is that there's a way in which the ability to improvise is being completely leached out of our culture, because everything is so quickly both set in stone and decontextualized. We were just saying that right after our talks, it was fascinating to look through Twitter and see all of the ways in which we'd been all misquoted or taken out of context, and like that's immediately, and but that's something, of course, we also do all the time, to other people. So there's this idea, we think of the the state and the corporation as an abstract and an other, but of course, as you were saying, it's absolutely us. We are the appalling super community.
All our own antagonists.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, with this, there seems to come also. It seems to come with like a profound dislocation of notions of public and private that used to be quite clear, where we don't really know the difference anymore between. Yeah. I mean, also on different scales between also private feelings and between interior feelings and outside world, almost like some kind of almost like in like a Russian novel or something, where you have a hard time distinguishing between grand narrative and personal and private emotions, but then also just economically or politically, public sphere and private sphere are intermingled to the point where it becomes very hard to sustain a certain kind of moral. A kind of moral division between a public good or private self benefit. I mean, and in a way, it can be almost liberating to just kind of chuck these notions, because they are really. I mean, if you look at how most publics were constructed formally, it really came from the state, right? Publics are usually confined by nation, and they're usually subsidized by states, and
I think publication and the circulation of media has a lot to do with that. I mean, not to go back to Michael Warner, but he has another book called Letters of the Republic, which is all about the formation of an American national identity, not through coercion of the state, not through some sort of false consensus, but rather through the development of communication networks and through various documents and publications through which people could recognize each other as readers and therefore as part of a public, which in certain ways preceded the constitution of a nation.
Right, right. But Michael Warner seems really important for this, because as a queer theorist also, because queer theory, I mean, he's writing about counterpublics. So as I remember in the essay, at least, it's actually it's about antagonizing and working against a public consensus. So in a way, I mean, queer thought is so interesting for always having trouble with the cleanliness of the division, right? I mean, if you want to, for example, I mean, even just in queer politics, if you want to bring the queer community above water, you just legalize gay marriage, and suddenly you have taxpayers, and everyone is can be a good kind of nuclear family in Jetsons or Leave It to Beaver style.
Are we entering the Jetsons period finally?
So maybe Jetsons is a bad example.
No, I think we're almost there.
But yeah, I mean, this is a really really strong. It's a really important debate within the queer community. are we supposed to actually, like, are we supposed to actually be, do we want to be accepted and normalized under these terms? Like, wasn't there actually something about deviant practices, and there was something to be defended in being marginal? Like, maybe we don't want to be a part of the public on these terms. Maybe we want to have our private culture.
I mean, what you're saying about the porousness of the membrane between public and private immediately for me provokes the questions of erasure and entitlement, because that dissolution between public and private and the way it's carried out on social web, I mean, how many of you have seen articles that are essentially a series of tweets captured and aggregated on a certain subject, right? So this popularity of aggregation is a form of content creation and publication through various outlets, and there have been a number of, again, very well-funded establishment media outlets that have entire sections that are populated by exclusively through aggregation. Of course, what and who they're aggregating is not something compensated. It goes back into the patterns of the exploitation of people who are newly accessing public spaces in which they're able to speak and participate. But again, it's not on equal terms. It is, again, an exchange that is normalizing free labor. And what the way I see people talk about this use of, to use a particular example of tweets in this particular way, is it's a bit unsettling, because, oftentimes you'll hear the argument, well, it's publicly available. It's right there. You posted it, so you must, you shouldn't be surprised then when people then share it or take it outside of the, to use the word of the day, community in which it was shared. So if you're having a conversation online with the community of your choosing, that is not necessarily to say that to welcome outsiders or people who aren't necessarily within that community to come in and take what you're putting out there for their own ends and purposes. And this has real consequences, because, the people who are aggregating that material and those tweets are generating sites of revenue for themselves. Those pages filled with the uncompensated words of others are creating revenue through ad clicks for all of these outlets, and whoever, whichever outlet that may be.
Huffington Post especially.
Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, The Atlantic, Al Jazeera. There's no one who sort of gets away scot-free from, who hasn't been guilty of doing this. But the argument that gets repeated on and on again is, if it's publicly visible, we are entitled to use it. It's a bizarre, replication of rape culture logic of visibility, meaning that if I can see it, I'm allowed to take it. And that to me is related to the question of the borders of community and how they're maintained, how they're policed, and who gets to really own them and enact them. So many of the people that I see creating and establishing interesting, necessary, vital, vibrant communities online, the borders of their communities is not something that they're able to exercise control over. And their exposure to not just violence and harassment from others, but also exploitation in more subtle but perhaps no less violent ways from people who aren't trolls, right? That's another word that gets used very often, but it has a range of meanings. So what constitutes trolling? And because that's a way of antagonizing communities.
And the question of context becomes so important. I'm thinking about performance pieces that get replicated online, right? That there's been in recent years an explosion of technologies that can really go a bit further in terms of capturing, live performances. And on the one hand, this is great, right? Because these works then can be disseminated and everybody can see them. And on the other hand, a lot of works, if you take them out of their very specific context of who is in the room, who is the community that it is initially for, they become something else entirely. I remember performers in a particular group being really upset that they had been recorded, and they no longer own that image, right? and then the image gets edited and put up as a clip on YouTube, and it becomes pornography because the context is stripped away. And I think that was we were talking about this last night, right? What is this sort of the tension between wanting to control the work that you're making, and then this drive for dissemination and for circulation.
And it's especially easy to control it if nobody cares about it.
Yes.
Which is why most of us probably haven't had so many problems in this regard.
I guess what we're talking about then, I guess, the attention economy, right?
I always think of, also with the public and private kind of thing, I always think of this kind of reformulation of the gated community in terms of as a kind of productive principle for marginal groups. That I think it was Marietta Zapatrich, the Slovene artist. She described the kind of model of the gated community as something that was being used by marginal communities in the Amazon to resist corporate like resource extraction, but she described it as this almost like a certain kind of like a panopticon or something where in a very basic way you have your security is ensured through like a one-way visibility where you can control who enters. Like you can leave and enter as you like, but you control who enters. So you can see out, but no one can see in. So it becomes actually like a technology of opacity, of protecting yourself and maintaining a certain kind of amount of control over what you do.
I wonder how you each relate to that with the particular publications and organizations you're involved with, and just how you navigate.
How we navigate what? Sorry.
Navigate the the desire to control your work, if that is a desire, to have it correctly contextualized, with understanding that what the economy is that we're in, and the the need or the pressure to have everything be circulated, be disseminated.
Right.
That's been a big issue, or kind of like something that has an animating concern for Triple Canopy. I think we started by looking at various magazines from the 60s and 70s, which were new media projects at the time. Aspen was especially important to us, and like Aspen, for instance, was a magazine in a box that was delivered to your door, and within that box you could find foldable sculptures, records, films, texts, and it was in some ways an exhibition packaged as a publication, and it made a very convincing argument for an expanded notion of what a magazine could be, and for the various material supports that can constitute a magazine. And it also, I think, opened up new relationships between authors and readers and publishers and editors. And not by coincidence, Aspen commissioned Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author and published it for the first time in a box with these various other media. And to encounter that text now, like reprinted in a collection of essays, to me is it's kind of a travesty. Of course, it's a quite nice essay read on its own, but it has this additional force within that environment. So we started with this idea of a highly regulated environment in which to encounter works of art and literature, and we developed a platform which made it especially difficult to for that work to travel elsewhere. You couldn't print anything. The pages are organized horizontally, so to copy and paste an entire essay, you would have to scroll from slide to slide to slide and go through the same manual operation many, many times. And generally people don't even have the attention to read something for more than 2 minutes, much less to spend 5 minutes copying and pasting. So that was like an effective and somewhat antagonistic move that that probably diminished our readership. But nevertheless, we have we care about developing an issue over a period of a year and a half, and we're very insistent on certain pieces responding to other pieces in certain ways, whether or not that is how they will be encountered by the majority of readers. Which is why it is especially surprising when a project that we publish becomes extremely popular and starts to circulate in an entirely different environment that we have no control over whatsoever. Which is not to say that that is regrettable at all. It is just not, at least initially it was not part of our calculus.
Mm-hmm.
I was also curious how you thought about Performance Club as a kind of proper context for not live art itself, but for the kinds of discussions and representations of live art that ensue after the performance ends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it used to. I guess the initial iteration of the Performance Club existed in what I didn't realize until yesterday was a golden age of comments on websites before they migrated elsewhere. It was astounding to me how immediate the conversation, how immediately the conversation began, and how strong and thoughtful it was, and it was quite. It became very easy to see that there was no community that I had created. Right, it was just there already, and it wanted a place to go to, and so I sort of got lucky with what I built.
But that also happens at a time when there are people are interested in these particularly vexing questions about how to represent and preserve and circulate performance. And it's not like you establish this as a receptacle for videos and increasingly realistic representations of an experience, of a performance in a time and space, right?
Right, because I can't, I think when it comes to performance, I'm a hopeless Luddite, and I just think you have to be in the room, and that's like, it's fine to watch a video, but it's not the thing. It may be the same way that a PDF printout of something you made. It's not the thing, right? It's just it's a facsimile.
I think it also has to do with how you imagine something being received in a year, 5 years, 10 years, and maybe valuing that over its immediate reception.
Mm-hmm. And also, I'm just thinking about the ways in which, the ways in which I understand things that happened in the past. Performance, thinking about visual art and performance in particular, it's through writers. It's through, unless most of the time I understand. Marina Abramovic's walk to Ule across the Great Wall because of Cindy Carr. Not because of the detritus that was at MoMA as part of her retrospective. And I think that the conversation around the ideas within performance was always more interesting to me than one of a constant criticism of my criticism is that I don't give enough description, which I always thought was also I was very happy with that criticism. Yeah.
I think on the issue of distortion, I think, just speaking as an editor, it's really terrifying to have things kind of munched up and changed into other things, because you want to have a certain amount of control over and precision. There is this, but then on the kind of in terms of the way that image and text circulate online, I think it's something that, in a way, at least for the journal, it was something that we never thought of really so much formally, or as something that happens formally or technologically, but as something maybe we kind of preempted it by thinking in terms of this kind of global distribution of discourse, right? So the distortion that we originally saw wasn't so much it was a kind of like original original distortion.
Like the premise is distortion.
Yeah, in the actual foundations, like the canonical foundations of art and like the shared references, that actually that had been completely, that has been like already scrambled. And so the question is like how to actually speak about art in a coherent way, granted that the shared references are already kind of so fragmented that that automatic consensus can't be taken for granted. Of course, this is a kind of, this is not something that exists so much in New York and in the U.S. in general, of course, because the canon in this part of the world is kind of subsidized by institutions, and which strengthen the idea of this kind of clear lineage and progression. But in many places this has already been distorted, unrecognizably, mangled, corrupted.
Well, on that note, there's a little bit of a belief that we're not being positive enough from our public.
You may have gotten the wrong panelist.
Yeah, sorry, you guys.
But this is positive.
I wonder.
Just us being here, being negative together is so positive.
I mean, well, none of our critiques offer like a rejection of anything. It's mostly inspired by motivation to make the necessary interventions to have a better status quo than the one we're trying to address here and now. So there's one for the naysayers.
Yeah, I think it's important to look at these things
would
first.
Well, I mean, it's beautifully, the language is beautiful, the sentiment is not beautiful, but you said that visibility in a surveillance state is not power. And I wonder if you or either of you two would, have thoughts as to what is power, and what does true ownership look like? Is it possible? We are getting questions about the best web platforms for creating community in a positive way.
I think it's really important what Aisha was saying, that what you were suggesting, you were pointing towards that, which is that like even though in spite of all of this distribution of agency, that the power still, this is really, really important, like the centers of power are still really the same, like the police are the police and the government is the government, right? But with this I always think of this thing from 2010 that it was kind of like a weird pilot project. Maybe people might have heard of this in the UK that David Cameron did, called Big Society, which is kind of a strange thing for one of the conservatives to do.
Because there's no such thing as society.
Because Thatcher said there is no such thing as society, but then in a kind of but then you flip it.
There is such a thing as big society.
But then you just flip it and you make it bigger. So now after his predecessors,
0 times 100.
Yeah, said there's exactly that. Exactly. There is no such thing as society. Suddenly now there is society, and it's a big one. But what is it? It was basically a kind of like conversion of government, of the functions of government and the functions of state into a social network. It was a kind of like Facebook welfare, like the welfare state turned into Facebook, where rather than having schools and hospitals and these kind of like silly old-fashioned things, right? You have the government functions as, where also the government has to give resources. Then you start to, the government actually tried to kind of like roll back its role from a kind of a supporting, something that supports with resources and supports as a kind of like weird telephone operator that just basically patches people together, right? So it administers this like big website. And it's a pilot project. I don't think it was actually implemented, but I think he was kind of testing the waters to see how kind of wacky things could possibly get with this. Where, basically if you like break your leg or something, sprain your ankle, and you say like, I need a doctor, then they will find you a doctor in your neighborhood. Or if you say, I want to learn something, then, I want to learn particle physics. And then so like big society will basically find someone in your neighborhood who can teach you about particle physics, right? So basically
that person always exists in one's neighborhood.
But the interesting thing about it is that it so profoundly liquidates the traditional function of the state, which is to actually administer and manage like the resources of the people, it converts that so profoundly that it actually starts to become kind of. Then that's the Jetsons. So then you go into the Jetsons territory where you start to imagine that, like, wow, okay, so if like Manchester is like not getting any funding from London, for instance, then you're kind of like Manchester starts to scratch its head and say like, well, but then what is actually the contract that is actually holding us together if no resources are changing hands?
It also assumes a certain privilege of who would be hooked into those networks to begin with. I mean, it makes me think of something I heard about. How in Detroit many people have like ambulance plans, right? That if you're in an accident, that you have somebody that you call, to take you to the hospital because the ambulances don't work. Which is, you can get an $8 cup of coffee, but you can't get an ambulance.
Yeah. Yeah, but these are basic life functions also that the state performs. They can't be deferred to. You can't Facebook your ambulance. This is like, so then the question is like, what is then how to like return to ethical questions of how power is supposed to operate when there are when the terms have changed so much, and when the terms have changed, but also the way that the ethics have changed around them.
Well, I think the thing that's changing is what types of labor and the types of labor that are making these platforms valuable, their interpretation, because I don't think, that lack of power that I was referencing is really a reproduction of the same social vulnerabilities that people experience offline, right? So when we were talking about public and private and erasure and entitlement and where power still is and isn't. As much as these corporate platforms produce their own ideologies and condition certain behavior, Facebook especially doing just straight out, experiments on its users and trying to elicit particular emotional responses and making various industries increasingly dependent. So it's not just your DIY project that's dependent on say Instagram censorship rules, or say if WordPress decides to shut down one day and the work that you may have been putting on there for years disappears, or etc. It's also the sense of entitlement and ownership we also practice as individuals and who we're taught to expect to feel power over. So as much as different types of people are using these platforms, they are not at all in the same boat. And, by this I'm talking about, these are obvious examples. A woman online has a very different experience than a man. A woman talking about American foreign policy and she is wearing a hijab in her avatar has a very different experience online than anyone else. I was thinking about that recently. A lot of American foreign policy pundits who are, white and or male, they'll have their name or something in their Twitter bio in Arabic script. It's like a popular trend to do, and it's so funny to see that when it's such a a bullshit hipster gesture, and all of the people for whom a person of color's experience online is conditioned by being a person of colors. As much as there is a new distribution of agency, the social vulnerabilities are the same, and the storytelling and the ability to own narratives by producing them yourself from within your own community for your own community makes more salient the things that are going to make you a target. And so your racial, national background, your sexual orientation, and so that's why as much as we call out the corporate seats of power, it's useful to also recognize the ways in which we participate in those power dynamics, because again we are also doing that. The entitlement we may feel over the image of, I was thinking about this a lot in the last podcast I recorded was about this, the entitlement we feel over Black images, right? So when you look at the trends of communicating via memes and GIFs and Vines, and how many things you've posted online and captioned "it me," right? Or you're talking to your friends and you're sharing how many times has the reaction GIF or the meme in that conversation been of a Black entertainer from, say, a reality show or a rapper, and the particular entitlement of that culture product, by everyone else, that's not really new. That's part of a tradition in American culture and is replicating like very long-standing historical relationships to who the producers of culture are and who are the people that ultimately gain the benefits of it. And just thinking about how much that entitlement to the way we use, pop cultural icons as personal avatars, the very grim juxtaposition of that to, in a country in which that's the norm, we don't have a comparable ability to, empathize with that Black pain. I mean, if we did, we wouldn't have as many police shootings as we do, right? So it's this, I think so many of the things that digital culture makes visible are existing facets of our society and culture. Mm-hmm. And what's new now is our ability to more effectively intervene in them, because it's not just a racist newspaper, right? It's us on Twitter. And I think interrogating our relationship to the circulation of imagery and the ways that we talk about these things is just as useful as calling out the ideologies and practice by the corporate platform owners.
Should we take a few questions?
Yeah, I mean, maybe we could talk briefly about something else, but I'm just curious, like how, like if we could talk about the circulation of images and words in terms of like how, in a concrete situation, power might be exercised. I mean, I think it might be useful to talk about what Olga was describing earlier in terms of like Tanya Bruguera's situation. I mean, just because that is a very straightforward metric for understanding whether or not what we do has any power that mm-hmm. can be exercised in a meaningful way. Of course, in this situation, we can't know what will happen in the coming weeks and months, but I mean that is, I think that to me is at least a more tangible, if not more meaningful, way of understanding what kind of power we might possess and whether it's worth anything.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I also want to do the same thing you did in your presentation. Like, you made a really great point about not treating community as to mean exclusively like positive, to have positive connotations. Mm-hmm. And I would want to do the same thing with power, right? Because it's not that these things don't have power, it's that they have a particular power and it may or may not be used for good. So think of the Je suis Charlie phenomenon and Charlie Hebdo and the ways in which, that became a trend, and that was not, corporate institutions, it was everyday people, it was people in media and culture and industry and just people who are unaffiliated with any of those tweeting their alliance with an outlet that was producing commentary that aligned with a long-standing active state agenda, and the ways in which, so much of the theater of solidarity and protest that Je suis Charlie and the Charlie Hebdo massacre and then the response produced, to me it made very clear the through lines I think you alluded to before between borders of state and culture and marketing. And I mean, I'm thinking then among the responses was all of these various heads of state standing in solidarity with this racist publication mm-hmm. and saying that, and the way that the stakes were, incorrectly mm-hmm. framed to be that of freedom mm-hmm. of speech and
right,
the ways
freedom of expression.
Yeah, exactly. Who was advantaged in that conversation? Right. Because that the participants spanned various seats of power or lack thereof.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the actions thereof were
but-
firmly within.
But I mean, that's why I think
patterns.
it's useful to talk about people organizing and speaking in order to achieve a very specific end, rather than in order to enrich a spectacle of solidarity.
I think we're out of time. Right? 12:20? I'm being told by the prompter that we're at 0.
Oh, we're in negative now.
territory.
We're negative now.
Being so negative.